control.
My name is Matthew Florians, if I can get this to work. Ha! And I'm a game audio designer at Frontier Development, and that means that I create sounds for video games. But I also have to implement sounds, and that's something that's changed quite a bit in the last 15 years. I've been in games for about 15 years now, and worked in a couple of games. And at the start of my career, about 15 years ago, sound design was pretty simple. You created a sound, got it from a library or any other means to get a sound. You put it in a game, and in the game there was some sort of trigger that would play the sound back. Mostly those triggers are based on distance, so you get close to a sound, the sound begins to play and then ramps up in volume as you get closer to it. But over that time, this has changed a bit. Part of my job is now also to implement sounds in game engines such as Wwise and Fmod, or Unreal has its own way of doing that as well. And that takes about half my time now. So I create a sound, but then I have to also make sure it works well in the game, because people expect a more, better sound design than we had about 15 years ago. Closer? Oh, ooh. Hi. So that's changed a little bit, and where it's going now, it's now going far more in the direction of creating entire systems. So no longer you're putting a sound on a source in a game. There's way too many sources now. You're now beginning to look at systems that gather data from the game and then analyze it and then make an intelligent decision to say that needs a sound and that doesn't. And that's where sound design is now going. So it's becoming more and more technical. And it helps to have a couple of those technical skills. It also helps to have coders on board that help you with that. But my talk is not really about the past or the future. It's about Elite Dangerous. I'm not sure if any of you've played this game. Thank you, you paid for my rents. It's a game that was first made in 1984 by Ian Bell and David Braben. And the amazing thing about it was that they created a game that gave you a small galaxy with several stars and planets, and you had a little ship, and you could fly between these places, and then dock and trade, or pirate, or kill other ships, just do whatever you want. And it was one of the very, very first sandbox games. And games like GTA have cited Elite as an influence. So the really amazing thing about it was that that entire game fit on less memory than this image you're looking at right now. So that was really a very good way of using procedural generated content. And that's still something that we do in Elite Dangerous. We use procedurally generated content to create the universe. And if you're looking at Sol, our system, there is star systems around it. There's also constellations around it. And any constellation that you see in the game, if you start moving away from Sol, they immediately start to distort. And that really gives you that sense that the universe isn't flat. It's really layers and layers and layers. And we use a system called the Stellar Forge. And it knows about how stars are formed, how planets are formed. And it's just churned away. And it kept calculating until it came up with this, 400 billion stars. If our entire community visits a star every minute, well, our lifetime, they would still not have gone everywhere. And the goal of the game is just to go between these places and trade, interact with other people, or find entirely new places to go. Because, I mean, we don't even know what's out there. And people like exploring this universe quite a lot. So if you're talking about that sort of science approach to the way we recreate the universe, a question we get a lot is, why didn't you go for no sound in space? The game has sound. And I think our head of audio says it a lot better than I could, and talks about how vast space is, and that sound has a really interesting role to play. It can translate mass and speed, and give you these senses that are very hard to translate if you're just sitting in a chair and looking at a screen. And I believe sound has a role in that respect. It can translate certain things that you cannot see. First of all, of course, it can show you things by sound that are outside of your scope of view, something standing behind you. But it can also give you a certain mood. This is a dangerous place. Even when the lighting and the camera aren't quite telling that yet. Or it can turn that entirely around. Maybe there's a place in your game where there's a really tense fight, and it just goes on, and you're thinking, well, maybe this is tense. Yes, tense music would work, but I want the player to feel optimistic here. I want them to feel like they can win this. So you choose to do something entirely different in the sound. And that's one of the interesting things that sound can do. So having made that decision, we tried no sound in space, of course. And yeah, we just thought it didn't work really well. So we made a decision to go for sound in space. And that's what this talk is about. I'm going to show you a few things about the game and how we did sound in Elite Dangerous. So let's start with some sound from the game. A few scenes that we like a lot.
Unsanctioned act of aggression will not be tolerated.
2, 1, engage. Cabin pressure alert.
So that last scene is one of the few places where we allow ourselves not to do sound in space, because it's a scene that never lasts more than 15 minutes. And I think people often bring up when they talk about why didn't you try no sound in space, is films and television. There's a lot of films out there that do it really well. And they have the advantage that they can cut away to a place where there is sound. In our game, you basically are the ship, so you can spend hours in that same environment and not having any sound, or at least the sound of no sound in space, which means everything reverberates through the hull, will get well, tiring over time. So when we made that decision to go for no sound in space, the first thing that was changed was the ships. The ships sounded very drony, and our lead audio, Joe Hogan, he decided that was one thing to tackle. And very similar reasoning to Jim Croft, the head of audio, is you feel disconnected if you don't have sounds. If the ship doesn't respond to what you're doing, you don't really get a sense of flying it. And he was kind enough to take the Sidewinder apart for us and show us several layers of it so you get an idea how it works. But let's start with listening to what it sounds like if you're flying it in-game, as the game is out now. So on my first day at the company, this was the first thing I did, and I crashed straight into an asteroid, but I loved the sound of that ship. So the first thing you heard were orientation noises. They're kind of important because the ship has a little bit of lag, if you will. They have inertia. So it takes a while for the ship to do what you want it to do. There's a little graphic in the right corner of the screen, and we'll zoom in on that, that shows you what the input is. And then the sound helps you bridge that gap between the ship is now actually going in the direction I want it to go and having made that input. So these are the orientation noises separated. And they're a combination of noises specifically for pitch, yaw, and roll, so they all work together in that way. And the other important part, of course, is getting a sense of speed and acceleration. And that's where the bigger sounds of the ship come in. Now you'll notice that we zoomed in on the speedometer, and there's a little bar there that goes up and down. That's the speed you set your ship at. And then there's these little blocks that go up and down as well. And there's a blue zone, and that blue zone represents where the ship is its most nimble. If you keep your ship in the blue zone, it will rotate the fastest, it will have the shortest turn circle, and that's important in combat, or if you want to evade somebody else. And the way the game works is you can equip all sorts of stuff on your ship. You can haul cargo around. And the heavier your ship is, the lower that blue zone goes. So the slower you're flying at the optimal turn circles. And people do all sorts of things to get a bit of an edge on other people. Some people even fly around without shields that protect your hull. And shields generate a lot of heat in this game. So heat is the one thing that you can see very well against the cold backdrop of space. So by dropping your shields, you sort of become invisible. That's another way of playing the game, and there's all these options of doing it. The sound responds to all of it. If your ship is heavier, the acceleration is a bit slower, but you can almost always hear when it's in the blue zone. And that's because there's all these layers on top of each other, all responding to what the ship is doing. And that was an important thing for us as well. Fly a ship and you understand what it's doing. Another important layer to ships is the sweeteners. That's where we give ships their own character. With this series of ships, they're all based on snake names. This is a Sidewinder, we have an Asp, we have an Adder. They're all very mechanical sounding. It's a very practical looking design. It's designed to go into an atmosphere and come back out again, although that's far off in the future if we ever do that. But that's why they look the way they look. They're built to last in space. And the sweetener layer, again, has these kind of oscillation rhythms. It sounds a little bit like rocket engines, and it's just there to give it a bit more character on top of all the mechanical noises. I'm going to skip this one because I'm running a bit out of time. So together, that sounds a little bit like this. We cheated a little bit by placing this in an environment where there's lots going past the camera. Most of the time you're fighting or flying in empty space, and that's where those sounds really give you that sense of feedback. Now, there's a whole range of ships in the game. What we just saw was a Sidewinder, and the Sidewinder is quite a big ship already. The cockpit that was on it is as large as a small car. So the whole ship is a couple of cars together. This is one of the biggest ships in the game. The Sidewinder would easily fit on a wing of this. And it's the Clipper for the Empire faction. Empire faction is based on the old Roman Empire. And they're all about showing off and about status. So their ships look very different from the design of the Sidewinder. And because they look so different, we chose to go for a slightly more synthesizer, glass sounds, choral sounds approach, just to give it that sort of different character. The visuals look very different. And also to make, to get that mass across. So again, the orientation noises. So if you take them apart like that, just hear one single sound and not all of them together, it sounds a little bit crappy. And that's part of the whole process as well, is finding the right kind of sounds that work together really well. One thing we do, for instance, because there's a lot of pitch shifting, is we use very narrow bands. So if a sound has a large spectrum, an EQ spectrum from bass to treble, we try to take as narrow a band as possible, because if you pitch that around, it holds up reasonably well, and it works together with the other sounds reasonably well as well. Speed and acceleration is the thing that gives you the feedback about speed, obviously. So here's where we did put a few more heavier sounds in and went for a little bit of motor, mechanical sounds. And finally, a layer of sweeteners where we brought in the kind of glass sounds, synthesizers, choir kind of sounds. Again, just to give this thing a real character of its own. And that sounds a little bit like this in game. You might be interested in how we do this in our middleware that we use. We use a program called Wwise. There's also Fmod. These are the two larger programs that handle sound creation, or basically using sounds in a game environment. And first of all, we create sounds, obviously. Those are small loops or individual sounds that we trigger in a row. And those sounds are on the left. That's the hierarchy of sounds that the ship uses. And then on the middle here, you see how we manipulate those sounds. And we have basically 4 ingredients that we can use. It's pitching. That means that the sound goes up and down. There's volume, which makes it louder and softer. And there's high and low passing, which is a little bit like removing the treble or the bass. And on this graph, you see everything combined, so it's a bit messy. Normally, you just do one at a time. But if you look at the blue line, for instance, that shows you that the low passing increases as the acceleration directional self decreases. Basically, what that means is if the ship stops accelerating, the sound gets low passed and it loses a bit of its treble. And doing these things in real time is what really gives these ships their character. So you make very short loops, 1 second, 2 second long, and then in real time it's being manipulated by data that we get from the game engine. And we've got loads of data coming in. Joe Hogan spent about a good month when he made the first ship just figuring out what data we needed to do ships really well. And he had help from coders. As I said, that's a very important part of sound design these days. You need to get good coders to help you with this. On the left, you see the other thing that we can do to sounds, and it's sort of guitar effects. We can put guitar effects on sounds as well in real time. And if you think of the pedal of a guitar effect, basically what the data really is just pushing down on that pedal and so changing the sound. Since this is, I think, a distortion effect, there's loads of points in here just to make sure the thing doesn't go entirely mental. Checking a ship doing this for a single ship takes about a week, because there's so many different things people can do with these things that you have to test through all these phases and make sure there's no weird stuff going on. If the engine blows out, sometimes the sound goes entirely mental, very loud. You have to make sure that doesn't happen once they go out. So that's a little bit about the ships. The other thing we changed when we went from no sound in space to sound in space was make the weapons sound a lot more interesting. In the first iteration, they all sound a little bit like reverberating through hull and with a glass plate, so there was a lot of low end, but it wasn't quality. And this actually went into our first version of the game that we released publicly, although that was an alpha version. So with the ships who were in time to make the switch, with the weapons who were not. So these were heard by a few people. And let's start by playing that old version of the cannon. So this weapon worked in the sense that when you press the trigger on your joypad or on the mouse, it felt responsive and it made you feel like, yeah, that's a good gun, I'm firing it, that's great. Difference often between a game and watching a video is that for a game your sounds have to take into account that you're listening to them a lot of times. You can't mix them specifically to the rest of the scene. So we have to make a sound that is both impressive but also doesn't fatigue over time and has a lot of playtime. If you play it over and over and over again, you can't get bored of it. So what we did for our first iteration of it, which is called version 2 on this slide, is we added a lot more detail layers. We emphasized the rotating of the gun itself, and We made the samples all stereo. That helps a lot in making them sound more interesting. And we also wanted to get that size of that thing across. The gun on the ship is about 2 meters large, so it needed to sound a little bit more, have a little more presence. And one of the funnier elements of that is that we used, well, that is one of the sounds for the gun. You take your sounds where you can get them. So this is a shot from a program called Vegas. This is one sound of the gun, namely the firing itself, just a single shot. The way this works is there's a timeline, and the bar goes from the left to the right, and whenever it encounters one of these little blocks, it will play back the sound that's there. And as you can see, there's quite a few layers on a single shot of this. So in the game, we play a shot, and we play a shot, and then we play a shot again in the speed that we needed to get that gun sound. And if we zoom in a little bit on that, you'll see that on the left, you've got these white sliders. And most of them are set very much to the left, which means the sound is quite quiet, except for the one on layer 4 and the one on layer 12, and on 6 is a bit louder as well. That's like on layer 4 is the main kind of shoot sound, and it's super short. We're looking at something that's about 10, maybe 20 milliseconds. And on all the other layers, you got your detail sounds, but they're very quiet. And by having those sounds very quiet, it just gives you that, you play it again, you play it again, you play it again, the sound stays interesting over time. We also added a little bit of sub-bass on layer 12, which is a very short kind of sound. And we did that for people who have a butt kicker, which is a pillow that they sit on, and it has a subwoofer in it, and it gives you immersion. And we bought one. It's weird. But we thought, let's put that sound in anyway, because we like our community, and we try to, where we can, we try to accommodate their wishes. Zooming in a little bit more, you can see that everything is spaced out quite a bit. If you play all the sounds at the same time, it wouldn't work. It would be a big mush. And on some of these sounds, we're only using like the top high end or the bass sound of it. So let's look at how that works in Wwise. So the sounds are all put in Wwise, and I've made a little video of the barrel sound, that rotating front part, and the firing. So that's how we can take these single sounds and manipulate them in real time by getting data from the game. Here I did it by hand, but this is for the animation speed. Sometimes the gun is a bit slower and faster, and this follows that procedure. If you think about sound design in games, we have to create something for every possible situation. Gamers notoriously like to see if they can break games. So if you have, for instance, the example of a door opening, you can't just play a door opening when somebody interacts with the door. Because gamers, being gamers, they'll probably stop halfway through and they close it and open it again and close it again and just keep doing weird stuff with it. So we need a sound for the door starting. We need a sound for the door is in motion, and a sound for when the door stops again. And that way we can just take care of all the possibilities that you can do in a game. And these sounds have to do that as well. So there's usually a start sound when you stop this. You can see that on the left as well. There's all these start and stop sounds and loop sounds to accommodate that. So we went from no sound in space to sound in space, and we have all these gameplay reasons for it. But the most important reason is no sound in space is very boring. And that's not our job. This is a game, and we need to entertain you. And that means that sometimes you make a decision where reality comes first, and sometimes you make a decision where gameplay comes first. And sound was definitely one of those decisions. And it was the right decision as well, I think, because we get a lot of feedback from people saying they really like the sound in this game. Even though the first question is always, why is there no sound in game? So as a final thing, I'd like to show you a battle scene from the game, and we've turned all the sound off, and over time we add layer by layer of sound back to it, and there's a little annotation on the top that tells you what sound is being added to the video.
Under attack. Shields offline. Taking damage. Under attack. Canopy compromised. Canopy critical. Target destroyed. Cabin pressure alert.
I'd like to show you the rest of the people that worked on that first version of Elite. Certainly I didn't do any of this. I did only a small part of this. And the composer as well, very important part of the team, was in there, as you heard from the last speech, was in there from the very first to make sure that it would all sound and work great. So thank you very much for being here and listening to me babble for about half an hour. Thank you very much for Control for having me. It was really nice. We're looking for people. So there's a jobs website over there, a little bit of advertising. And there's more examples of Elite Dangerous sound design on my own website. Thank you very much.